"You're fired." The boss told the courier, unaware he just saved his daughter. The evening air bit at Jake Miller's face as he pedaled hard down Clark Street, the chaotic pulse of Chicago thrumming around him. Car horns blared, headlights streaked past in a blur, and the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt hung heavy. His bike tires hummed against the pavement, cutting through the late March chill. At 25, Jake was lean and scrappy, his faded gray hoodie flapping behind him like a flag of surrender to a city that didn't care. He'd been at this gig for 2 years, delivering pizzas, burgers, whatever people ordered through the app, because it paid the bills, or at least kept him from drowning in them. Tonight, the delivery bag strapped to his back bounced with a large pepperoni pie, already 5 minutes late thanks to a snarl of traffic near the loop. He muttered a curse under his breath, knowing the customer would dock his tip.
The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the road.
Jake swerved around a pothole, the kind you only find in a city that's been through too many winters, and glanced at his phone mounted on the handlebars. One more turn, and he'd be at the drop-off.
10. A sharp sound slice trug an oase. A scream, raw and desperate, echoing from an alley just off Clark.
His head snapped toward it. Another cry followed, fainter but no less urgent. Without a second thought, he slammed on the brakes, the bike skidding to a stop. The pizza bag hit the ground with a dull thud as he leapt off, his sneakers slapping the wet pavement. The alley was narrow, framed by brick walls stained with years of grime. The dim glow of a single street lamp barely reached inside, but Jake could make out shapes, 3 figures looming over a fourth. A woman's voice cracked, pleading, "Get away from me." Adrenaline surged through him, drowning out the rational part of his brain screaming to mind his own business. He charged in, shouting, "Hey! Leave her alone." The 3 guys turned, their faces shadowed under hoods, but their postures shifted, tense, ready. One of them, broad-shouldered and reeking of cheap beer, sneered, "Who the hell are you?" Jake didn't answer.
He swung a fist, catching Ziggy square in the yav.
Pain flared in his knuckles, but it worked. The thug stumbled back, cursing. The other 2 lunged. A fist clipped Jake's cheek, sending a jolt through his skull, and a kick landed in his ribs, knocking the wind out of him. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood, and shoved one of them hard into a dumpster. Metal clanged as the guy hit it, groaning.
The woman scrambled free, her breath hitching in sobs. "Get outta here."
Jake yelled at her, ducking a wild swing from the 3rd guy. She didn't hesitate, her footsteps echoed as she bolted toward the street, disappearing into the night. The brawl didn't last long after that. The thugs, maybe spooked by the noise or the chance of cops, backed off, spitting threats as they retreated deeper into the alley. "You're dead, man," one of them snarled, his voice swallowed by the dark. Jake stood there, panting, hands on his knees. His cheek throbbed, and a dull ache spread through his side. He glanced at the ground. The pizza box lay crumpled, sauce leaking through the cardboard. "Great," he muttered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The woman's shaky thank you lingered in his ears, but she was gone. No name, no face he could place, just a ghost who'd cost him his night. By the time he retrieved his bike and pedaled back to the hub, the city had settled into its usual restless hum. The delivery office sat tucked off Michigan Avenue, a squat brick building with chipped paint and a neon open sign buzzing in the window. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet, a faint tang of grease clinging to everything. Jake dropped the ruined pizza on the counter, bracing himself. Tom Bradley, his boss, was already pacing behind the desk, a bear of a man 50, with graying hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. He'd built this little delivery empire from scratch, and he ran it like a drill sergeant.
"What's this?" Tom barked, yapping a finger at the mangled box.
His voice boomed, cutting through the hum of a radio playing some classic rock station. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, the bruise on his cheek pulsing. "Got held up." "Something came up," he started, but Tom cut him off. "Held up? You think I care about your excuses?"
"The clean's pissed, Jake."
"Called me screaming about cold food." Tom's eyes narrowed, his meaty hands slamming the desk.
2 years, and you still can't get it right. Jure Done, Miller.
Fired.
Get your stoof and go.
Jake's stomach dropped. He opened his mouth to argue, about the alley, the woman, the fight, but the word stuck. Tom wasn't the listening type. "Fine," Jake muttered, grabbing his backpack from a chair. The other couriers in the room, two guys sipping energy drinks, avoided his gaze, their silence louder than Tom's yelling. Jake pushed through the door, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He walked a block to the L station, the elevated tracks rattling overhead as a train screeched by. Slumping onto a bench, he stared at the skyline, the Willis Tower piercing the clouds, lights twinkling like a promise he couldn't reach. His mind replayed the night.
The scream, the fists, the woman's trembling voice.
Was it worth it? He'd saved her, sure, but now he was jobless, bruised and broke. The city didn't care about heroes, it chewed them up and spat them out. He leaned back, the bench's metal slats digging into his spine, and let the distant rumble of traffic fill the quiet. Maybe he'd made a mistake, sticking his neck out like that. Maybe it didn't matter at all. Back at the hub, the door creaked open again. A young woman stepped inside, 20 maybe, with dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her coat still damp from the drizzle. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, though her eyes flickered with something unsteady. "Dad," she called, her voice soft but firm. Tom looked up from his paperwork, his scowl softening just a fraction. "Emily? What are you doing here this late?" She crossed the room, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, and leaned against the desk. "Just needed to see you," she said, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. Tom grunted, already turning back to his ledger, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond his sight.
The next morning broke grey and heavy over Chicago. The kind of day where the clouds pressed low and the wind carried a beat.
Jake Miller woke up on the lumpy couch in his Logan Square apartment, a one-room hole with peeling paint and a radiator that clanked like it was auditioning for a horror flick. His cheek still ached from the punch he'd taken in the alley, a faint purple bruise blooming under his eye. He rolled over, the springs creaking beneath him, and stared at the ceiling. The events of last night replayed in jagged flashes, the scream cutting through the traffic, the thud of fists, the woman's trembling thank you before she vanished. And then Tom's voice, sharp as a blade, "You're fired." Jake rubbed his face, the stubble rough against his palms, and muttered, "What a mess." He dragged himself up, the hardwood floor cold under his bare feet, and shuffled to the window. Outside, the neighborhood buzzed with its usual rhythm, cars honking on Milwaukee Avenue, the distant rumble of the Blue Line train, a guy yelling about tamales from a cart down the block. The smell of fried dough and exhaust drifted up, mixing with the stale air of his place. Jake's phone buzzed on the coffee table, a scratched-up slab of what he'd scavenged from a curb. A text from an old courier buddy, "Heard you got canned.
Took break."
He tossed the phone aside without replying. Word traveled fast in this game, and a rep for screwing up was death for a gig worker. He needed a new job pronto, or the rent wouldn't clear. By noon, he was out pounding the pavement, his hoodie zipped tight against the wind. He hit up every delivery spot he knew, pizza joints in Wicker Park, a burger shack off Division Street, even a fancy coffee place near the Art Institute that paid extra for bike runs. But the story was the same everywhere. "Heard about you, man.
Kennt risky tea."
One manager, a wiry guy with a mustache, leaned over the counter and smirked.
"Tom Scotta lut mut."
"Said you ditched an order mid-shift. That true?" Jake clenched his jaw, the memory of the alley flaring up, the thug's fist slamming into his face, the woman's panicked breaths. "Something like that," he said, turning away. No point in explaining. Nobody cared about the why. Across town, Emily Bradley sat in her dad's office, perched on a chair by the window. The delivery hub hummed around her, couriers clocking in, the radio crackling with some Springsteen tune, the faint whir of a space heater fighting the draft. She'd come by to grab a spare key, but her mind was elsewhere. Her fingers twisted a strand of her dark hair as she stared out at Michigan Avenue, the skyscrapers glinting through the haze. She couldn't shake the image of the guy from the alley, his wild swing at the thugs, the way he'd yelled at her to run. She'd barely slept, her dreams a tangle of shadows, and that one clear moment, his eyes meeting hers, fierce and steady, before she bolted.
"Dad, Shesait, breaking the silence."
Tom looked up from his laptop, his bushy eyebrows knitting together.
"Yeah, hon."
She hesitated, then said, "Something happened last night. Near Clark Street. These guys, they jumped me." Tom's face darkened, his chair scraping back as he stood. "What?
"Are you okay?"
Why didn't you call me?" His voice was all edges, protective and pissed.
"Emily reiset a hand."
"I'm fine. Someone helped me. Some guy," he fought them off. Tom exhaled, running a hand through his gray hair. Good. Did you get his name? She shook her head. No. He just told me to go. And I ran. Tom grunted, already turning back to his screen.
Lucky break. You gotta be careful out there,
He didn't ask more, didn't connect the dots. To him, it was just another story of the city's chaos. Jake's day didn't get better. He stopped at a diner on Fullerton, a greasy spoon with chipped mugs and the smell of bacon clinging to the air. He slid into a booth, nursing a coffee that tasted like burnt regret, when a familiar face walked in. Pete, a wiry guy he'd worked shifts with at Tom's place. Pete spotted him and grinned, sliding into the seat across. Well, look who it is.
The legend himself.
Jake glared over the rim of his mug.
Not in the mood, Pete.
The guy leaned back, smirking.
Heard you trashed an order last night. Wat, to busy playing hero some wäre.
Jake's grip tightened on the cup, the memory hitting again. The thug's snarl, "You're dead," echoing in the dark. Something like that, he said again, his voice low. Pete laughed, loud and grating.
Man, you're a walking disaster.
Good luck finding work now. It took everything not to swing at him. Jake shoved a crumpled 5 on the table and walked out, the bell above the door jangling behind him. The wind hit his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, the city stretching out indifferent and endless. He headed home, cutting through a park where kids shouted over a basketball game, their voices sharp against the rustle of bare trees. Back in his apartment, he dropped onto the couch, staring out the window again. The skyline glowed faintly, a promise he couldn't touch. Maybe I should have kept pedaling, he thought, his mind drifting back to the alley. Saved her, and what did it get me? Kicked to the curb. The radiator clanked, a hollow sound that matched the ache in his chest. Meanwhile, Emily was on her phone, scrolling through Instagram on a whim. She'd remembered something, the guy's bike, a beat-up red thing with a sticker on the frame. She typed Chicago bike couriers into the search bar, her thumb hovering as posts loaded. A photo caught her eye, a group shot from some delivery meetup, and there he was in the back, hoodie up, that same steady look in his eyes.
Herbreed kaukt.
She zoomed in, her heart thudding. That's him, she whispered. She tapped the profile.
Et Jakem _Riedes.
But it was private. Still, she had a lead. She glanced out the window, the city sprawling below, and made up her mind. She had to find him. Out on Diversey Avenue, Jake pedaled slow, running a personal errand to grab groceries. The streets were alive, cars honking, a bus wheezing past, the faint strum of a street guitarist near a corner store. He didn't notice Emily across the road, her coat pulled tight as she waited at a crosswalk. She spotted him, her eyes widening, and called out, "Hey!" But the light changed, and a wave of traffic swallowed her voice. He turned a corner, gone before she could cross. She stood there, the wind tugging at her hair, determination settling in. "I'll find you," she said to herself, her words lost in the city's roar. The afternoon sun hung low over Chicago, painting the skyline in shades of orange and steel gray as Jake Miller pedaled back to his Logan Square apartment, a bag of groceries swinging from his handlebars. The city churned around him, cars growled down Milwaukee Avenue, a CTA bus hissed to a stop, and the faint scent of grilled hot dogs wafted from a vendor's cart. His bruised cheeks still throbbed, a dull reminder of the alley fight 2 nights ago, but the sting of Tom's words cut deeper. "You're fired." He'd spent the day hitting dead ends, every delivery joint turning him away like he was cursed. The weight of it pressed on his chest, heavier than the wind pushing against him now. Inside his cramped place, he dropped the bag on the counter, a dented can of soup, a loaf of bread, some cheap coffee, and slumped onto the couch.
The radiator klingt, a Stubborn erhalbsil unterm against the Quiet.
His phone buzzed, another text from Pete. "Heard you struck out at Lou's Pizza.
Keep swinging, champ."
Jake tossed it aside, his jaw tight. The guy was a jackass, but he wasn't wrong. The city's delivery scene was small, and Tom's loud mouth had torched Jake's chances. He leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling, and let his mind drift. The alley flashed up again, the woman's cry, the thug's fist, that fleeting thank you before she ran. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? So why did it feel like he'd lost everything for it? A sharp knock jolted him upright. He frowned, crossing the room in 3 strides to yank the door open.
Teresche Stot, the woman from the alley.
Emily Bradley, though he didn't know her name yet, looked smaller in the daylight, her dark hair tucked under a knit cap, her coat still zipped against the March chill. Her eyes widened, recognition flickering, then softened. "It's you," she said, her voice steady but laced with something fragile. Jake froze, his hand gripping the doorknob. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snapped, harsher than he meant. She flinched but didn't back off. "I had to find you.
You saved me that night.
I wanted to thank you, really thank you."
Jakes gut twisted.
Her gratitude should have felt good, but it didn't. It burned, mixing with the bitterness he'd been stewing in all day. "Yeah, well, don't bother," he said, stepping back. "I don't need your thanks." Emily frowned, tilting her head. "Wait, why? You fought those guys off."
You got hurt, ISAVIT.
He laughed, a short, bitter sound, and ran a hand through his messy hair. "Oh, I got more than hurt. Your dad, he's my boss, or was, fired me for ditching that delivery to help you. So keep your thanks and go back to him." Her face fell, confusion giving way to shock. "My dad?"
You mean Tom Bradley?
Jake nodded, his glare cutting through her.
Yeah. So excuse me if I'm not feeling real grateful right now.
Emily's mouth opened, then closed, like she couldn't find the words. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice small. "I'm so sorry." Jake turned away, staring at the wall, the peeling paint a map of nowhere.
Dus en change a nuting.
"Just go." She lingered, her sneakers scuffing the floor, then nodded. "Okay. But I'm not done with this."
The door clicked shoot behind her, leaving the room quieter before.
Jake sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "Great," he muttered. "Now she's sorry. Lot of good that does me." The city hummed outside, indifferent as ever while he sat there, replaying her face, those eyes wide and earnest, like she actually cared. It didn't make sense. Why'd she track him down? What did she want? Across town, Tom Bradley sat in his office, the delivery hub winding down for the day. The radio played low, some old Stones track, and the space heater buzzed in the corner. He was hunched over a stack of invoices when Emily burst in, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, shutting the door. Tom looked up, his scowl easing at the sight of her.
"What is up, eh? You okay?"
She paced, tugging off her cap. "That guy who saved me, he worked for you.
Jake Miller.
You fired him." Tom's brow furrowed, the name clicking.
Miller?
The screw-up who ditched an order?
What's he got to do with you?
Emily stopped, her hands balling into fists.
Everything.
He ditched it to help me. Those guys in the alley, he fought them off. Tom leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice gruff but uncertain. Emily nodded. "I just saw him. He's pissed, Dad, and I don't blame him." Tom rubbed his jaw, staring at the desk. He remembered Jake, quiet kid, decent worker till that night.
Could it be true?
He waved a hand.
I look into it go home, I got this.
She hesitated, then left, her footsteps fading down the hall.
Tom Satire, the home of the theater filling the silence.
If she was right, he'd made a hell of a mistake. But he wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. Jake didn't stay still long. He grabbed his bike, needing air, and pedaled toward the river, the Chicago skyline looming ahead. The wind whipped past, carrying the faint tang of water and rust. He stopped near the Kinsey Street Bridge, leaning his bike against a railing. The water flowed dark and slow below, reflecting the city lights like broken promises. He kicked a pebble into it, watching the ripples spread. Should have kept my head down, he thought, the fight replaying again, the thug's threat, "You're dead," ringing in his ears. Maybe they'd meant it. Maybe this wasn't over. He didn't hear the car pull up behind him, a beat-up sedan with a dented fender. Two guys climbed out, the same broad-shouldered thug from the alley and his buddy, their faces hard under the streetlights. "Well, well," the big one said, cracking his knuckles. "Told you you're dead, punk." Jake spun, his pulse spiking. They'd tracked him. How? His bike, maybe, that stupid red frame he'd never bothered to repaint. "Back off," he said, stepping away, but the bridge hemmed him in. The second guy smirked, pulling a switchblade that glinted in the dark. Not this time. Jake bolted, adrenaline flooding his veins. He darted past a warehouse, the thud of their boots close behind. His lungs burned as he cut through an empty lot, chain-link fences rattling as he vaulted one. He ducked into a stairwell off a side street, the concrete cold against his back, and held his breath. Their voices echoed, close, then fading. "We'll find you, asshole," one shouted, the word swallowed by the wind.
Jake slid down the wall. His heart hammering.
"What the hell?" he whispered, his hands shaking. The city loomed around him, vast and uncaring, as the night pressed in. Emily's visit, Tom's ignorance, and now this, it was all crashing together, and he didn't know how to climb out.
The night deepened over Chicago. The wind howling of the river as Jake Miller crouched in the stairwell. His breath fogging in the cold.
The echoes of the thugs' threats lingered. "We'll find you, asshole." Their footsteps fading into the hum of the city. His heart still raced, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs, and his hands trembled as he pressed them to the concrete wall. The bruise on his cheek pulsed, a souvenir from the alley fight, but now it was joined by fresh fear. They'd tracked him, those bastards, probably from the red bike he'd left by the bridge. He cursed himself for not ditching it sooner. The stairwell smelled of damp stone and rust, the kind of stale air that clung to abandoned places, and he stayed low, listening for any sign they doubled back. Minutes stretched, the distant wail of a siren cutting through the quiet. Jake eased up, peering out. The street was empty, sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting pools of yellow on cracked pavement. His bike stood alone by the railing, a sitting duck. No way he'd risk grabbing it now. He slipped out, keeping to the shadows, and headed south along the river, the water's dark surface glinting under the moon. The south branch stretched ahead, lined with old warehouses and rusted cranes, relics of a city that used to build things. He needed to lose them, figure out a plan, but his mind spun, Emily's visit, Tom's ignorance, and now this. It was like the universe was piling on, daring him to break. He cut through an alley, the wind carrying the faint tang of diesel and rotting garbage. When he heard it, tires crunching gravel, low and deliberate. Headlights flashed, pinning him against a brick wall. The sedan rolled up, that same dented fender gleaming like a bad omen. The two thugs climbed out, the broad-shouldered one cracking his neck, the other twirling that switchblade with a grin. "Thought you'd run, huh?" the big one said, his voice gravelly and smug. Jake's stomach dropped. "I told you to back off," he said, backing toward a chain-link fence, but they closed in, cutting off his escape. The warehouse loomed behind them, its broken windows staring down like empty eyes.
The fight came fast.
The big guy swung, a meaty fist Jake barely dodged, his shoulder slamming into the fence. Pain flared, but he ducked low and tackled the guy, driving him into the dirt. They hit hard, gravel biting into Jake's palms as he landed a punch, once, twice, before the thug roared and threw him off. Jake stumbled, air rushing out of him, and then the second guy was on him, the blade slashing close. It grazed his arm, a hot sting that made him hiss, blood welling through his torn sleeve. He kicked out, catching the guy's shin, and scrambled up, chest heaving.
"Jure Done." The big one snarled, lunging again.
Jake dodged, but a fist caught his jaw, snapping his head back. He tasted copper, vision blurring, and fell hard against a stack of crates. The world tilted, the warehouse spinning as they closed in. Jake clawed at the dirt, his fingers finding a rusted pipe. He swung it, wild and desperate, cracking the big guy's knee. The thug howled, staggering, but the blade guy charged, pinning Jake's arm. The pipe clattered away, useless, and a boot slammed into his ribs. Pain exploded, white-hot, and he curled in, gasping. "Should have stayed out of it," the guy sneered, raising the knife. Jake braced, his mind screaming, this was it, all because he'd stopped that night on Clark Street. Then, headlights flared again brighter, accompanied by a horn's sharp blast. Emily Bradley screeched to a stop in her beat-up Honda, gravel spraying. She'd followed him from Logan Square, her gut telling her something was wrong after he'd brushed her off. She'd lost him near the river but kept driving, scanning the dark, until she saw the fight. "Get away from him," she yelled, leaping out, phone already in hand.
"I'm killing the cops."
The thugs froze, the big one swearing under his breath. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone nearby must have heard the noise. "Let's go," the blade guy muttered, and they bolted for their car, peeling out as red and blue lights flickered closer. Emily ran to Jake, dropping to her knees. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking. He coughed, wincing, blood streaking his chin. "Been better," he rasped, pushing himself up. Cops swarmed the lot, flashlights sweeping as they cuffed the fleeing thugs against their sedan. Jake sat on the ground, the cold seeping through his jeans, while an officer took Emily's statement. She kept glancing at him, her face pale under the warehouse's shadow. The paramedics arrived, but Jake waved them off. Nothing broken, just bruises and a shallow cut. Then a familiar truck pulled up, its engine rumbling. Tom Bradley stepped out, his coat flapping in the wind, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Emily rushed to him. "Dad, it's him, Jake. He saved me that night, and now this." Tom's gaze shifted to Jake, sprawled in the dirt, and something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe regret. He crossed the lot, boots crunching gravel, and stopped in front of Jake. The air hung heavy, the distant river lapping against its banks, the cop radios crackling. Tom's shadow loomed, his breath fogging in the chill. "Emily says you're the one," he said, his voice low, gruff but unsteady. "That night on Clark Street, you fought for her." Jake looked up, his jaw tight, blood drying on his lip. "Yeah. And you fired me for it." Tom flinched, just barely, his hands flexing at his sides. He knelt, eye level now, and the hardness in his face cracked. "I didn't know, kid."
"You saved my girl. I was wrong. That wrong. Forgive me, son."
His words hung there, raw and heavy, the weight of a man who'd built a life on control and just lost it. Jake stared at him, the pain in his ribs pulsing, the night's chaos swirling in his head. Tom's eyes were steady, pleading in a way Jake hadn't expected. He didn't know what to say, anger still burned, but it flickered unsteady. "Yeah, well," he muttered, looking away, "shit happens." Tom nodded, slow, like he understood more than Jake said. He stood, offering a hand, but Jake pushed himself up alone, wincing as he straightened. The stars glittered above, faint through the city's glow, and he turned to them, letting the cold air sting his lungs. Sometimes life hits you, he thought, just to see if you'll hit back. Emily watched him, her hands stuffed in her pockets, while Tom spoke to the cops, his voice carrying over the wind. The scene settled, the thugs hauled off in a squad car, their threat silenced for now.
Jake leaned against a krate. The warehouses jagged silhouette framing the night.
His arm throbbed where the blade had nicked him, a thin line of blood staining his sleeve, but he barely felt it. Tom's apology echoed, mingling with Emily's wide-eyed stare. He didn't know what came next, forgiveness, a fight, or just walking away. The river flowed on, steady and quiet, as the city pulsed around them, waiting for whatever he'd choose. Dawn crept over Chicago, a slow spill of light that softened the city's edges as Jake Miller sat on a gurney by the warehouse, a paramedic dabbing at the cut on his arm. The sting of antiseptic bit into the night's haze, pulling him back from the blur of fists and headlights. The cops had hauled the thugs away, their sedan towed off the lot, and the air settled into a quiet hum, distant traffic, the river's murmur, the faint squawk of a radio as officers wrapped up. His ribs ached with every breath, a dull thudding reminder of the boot that had caught him, but he waved off the medic's insistence on a hospital run. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough, though the blood on his sleeve said otherwise. Emily hovered nearby, her coat pulled tight, her eyes flicking between him and her dad. Tom Bradley stood a few yards off, talking low with a cop, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of diesel and wet earth from the South Branch. He'd said his piece, those raw, cracked words, "Forgive me, son," and now he looked smaller somehow, less the tyrant who'd barked Jake out of a job and more a man caught off guard by his own mistakes. Jake watched him, the anger still simmering but muddled now, tangled with exhaustion and something he couldn't name. Emily stepped closer, her sneakers crunching gravel. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice soft.
"Follow me. Call the cops. I'll off it."
Jake shrugged, wincing as the motion pulled at his ribs. "Didn't plan to get jumped either. Guess we're even." She smiled, faint but real, and it hit him, those same wide eyes from the alley, the ones he'd seen through the chaos on Clark Street. "Not even close," she said.
"You saved me twisse now."
He looked away, the skyline catching the first rays of sun, steel and glass glinting like a promise he'd never trusted. The paramedic finished taping his arm, and Jake slid off the gurney, testing his weight. Tom turned then, his boots scuffing the dirt as he walked over. "Miller," he said, his tone gruff but steady. "We need to talk." Jake tensed, bracing for another round, but Tom raised a hand. "Not here. Tomorrow. My office."
Nein, sharp.
He didn't wait for an answer, just nodded to Emily and headed for his truck, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled away. The next morning, Jake walked into the delivery hub off Michigan Avenue, the familiar buzz of the place hitting him like a memory he'd rather forget. The air smelled of burnt coffee and cardboard, the radio crackling with some blues riff, and a couple couriers lounged by the counter, sipping Red Bulls. His hoodie hung loose over a fresh shirt, hiding the bruises purpling his side. Tom sat behind his desk, the same scowl etched into his face, but his eyes softened when Jake stepped in. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair. Jake stayed standing, arms crossed. "What's this about?" Tom leaned back, the chair creaking under him. "You're back on the payroll. Starting today. Not just writing, either, supervisor gig.
Better pay, better horse. You earned it.
Jake blinked, the words landing like a punch he hadn't seen coming. "You serious?" he asked, his voice flat. Tom nodded, tapping a pen on the desk.
"That's serious."
"What you did for Emily, I don't forget that. I was an ass, and I'm fixing it." Jake shifted, the ache in his ribs flaring as he processed it. A job better than before, handed back like it hadn't been ripped away. He wanted to say no, to shove it in Tom's face, but the reality of his empty bank account and the thug's threats held him quiet. "Fine," he said finally. "But don't think this squares us." Tom's mouth twitched, not quite a smile.
Fair enough. Start tomorrow.
Jake turned to go, the weight lifting just a fraction as he stepped into the daylight. Days blurred into a week, the city settling into its restless rhythm. The thugs faced trial, assault, weapons charges, and Jake's name stayed out of it, thanks to Emily's statement. He worked the hub now, barking orders instead of pedaling, his bike gathering dust in his apartment. It felt strange being still, but the paychecks cleared, and the bruises faded. One evening, Emily showed up at his place in Logan Square, a paper bag in hand. "Thought you might want company," she said, stepping inside. The room was sparse, couch, coffee table, a flickering lamp, but it smelled of fresh coffee as Jake brewed a pot. She pulled out a six-pack of Goose Island beer and a pizza from a joint down the street, the box warm in her hands. "Peace offering," she grinned, setting it on the table. They sat, the pizza steaming between them, the crust crisp and the cheese dripping just right. The radio played low, some old Tom Petty tune, and the radiator clanked its usual song. "You didn't have to," Jake said, cracking a beer. Emily shrugged, taking a slice. "Wanted to. Besides, you were like a superhero that night, diving in, no hesitation. I owe you more than this." He snorted, the memory sharp, the alley, the fists, her running. "Not sure I'd call it that. Got my ass kicked plenty." She laughed, bright and easy, and it cut through the room's quiet. "Still counts," she said, her eyes meeting his, steady and warm. The door buzzed, and Jake frowned, wiping his hands on his jeans as he answered it. Tom stood there, a box of donuts in hand, the kind with powdered sugar that dusted his coat. "Wife made too many," he said, gruff as ever, stepping in without asking.
He sets the box down, nodding to Emily.
"Figured I'd check in." Jake leaned against the counter, watching him, the tension still there but softer now. "Donuts, huh?" he said dry. Tom grunted.
"Yeah. And, look, Keith, you're a family now. Like IT or not."
He clapped Jake's shoulder, firm but careful, and grabbed a slice of pizza, settling into a chair like he belonged. They ate, the three of them, the room filling with small talk, Emily teasing Tom about his terrible taste in music, Jake ribbing her about her beat-up car. The city hummed outside, the blue line rattling past, headlights streaking through the window. Jake leaned back, a donut in hand, the sugar sticking to his fingers. He watched them, Tom's gruff laugh, Emily's quick smile, and felt something shift, a warmth he hadn't expected. The fight, the firing, the chaos, it had led here, to this cramped kitchen with its creaking chair and flickering light. He sipped his beer, the bitterness sharp against the sweet, and glanced out at the skyline, its glow steady now, not so out of reach. Later, after Tom left and Emily crashed on the couch, Jake stood by the window, the night pressing close. The river flowed somewhere out there, the city sprawling beyond, full of chances and traps he couldn't see. Sometimes you risk it all, he thought, the donut's sugar still on his tongue, and it hands you something back. He didn't know what came next, more fights, more quiet nights like this. But for once, he wasn't running from it. The radiator clanked, the sound steady as a heartbeat, and he let it carry him into whatever waited. Thank you for spending time with our heroes. Share your thoughts in the comments if this story resonated with your heart. Like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other touching stories. Share this video with your friends, it might inspire something important.